This course is about HTML and CSS, not JavaScript. But in my opinion, a modern web design course is not doing its job if it doesn't at least familiarize its students with what JavaScript is used for. So in this section of the course, we will learn how to leverage JavaScript without writing JavaScript. So what does that mean? It means that writing JavaScript code is outside the scope of this course. But it also means that you have enough HTML and CSS knowledge to begin adding JavaScript functionality to your pages right now, today. And in the process, you will learn a bit more about what JavaScript is, what it's used for, and why it will most likely be the next to-do item on your things to learn list. Now, instead of spending the next 60 seconds attempting to summarize what JavaScript is, we are just going to jump straight into our first task. So in this particular lesson, we are going to learn how to set up a slideshow. In front of you is an example page that I've set up for this lesson, and here we can see the finished product. This is a slideshow. So we can see that it transitions between the different slides, and if I hover over it, these previous and next buttons appear, and if I click them, we can rapidly change through the slides. We also notice pagination, or a pager at the top. So there are 3 dots corresponding with the 3 different slides, and the current or active slide is represented by the black dot. Now again, this is the finished product, and staring at a finished product isn't very educational. We need to start from square one together and work our way up. So in this tab, we can do just that. This page does not feature a slideshow, it's simply 3 images, a bee, a duck, and a squirrel, all sitting below one another. And in terms of HTML, this is nothing more than 3 instances of the image element. So how can we transform this into the slideshow that we saw just a moment ago? The recipe has 2 ingredients. Number 1, custom HTML and CSS, which we are fully capable of writing. And the second and final ingredient is a pre-existing JavaScript solution named Cycle2, which is written by the brilliant Mike Alsup. Now in the name of fun, let's jump straight to that final ingredient, Cycle2. Now I just downloaded Cycle2 behind the scenes. It's on my desktop. Here it is. You can perform a web search for Cycle2, or you can find this file in the downloadable zip for this lecture. So Cycle2 comes in the form of a .js or JavaScript file. So our first step after we've downloaded the file is to move the file to live with all of our other website files. So here's my website folder, here's the web page, here's our CSS folder, here is our images folder. I'm going to create a new folder named JS, which stands for JavaScript, just to stay organized. Next, let's move the Cycle2 file to live within this new JS folder. Our next step is to include this file in the head section of our HTML page, just like we would a CSS file. Only the syntax for attaching a JavaScript file is a bit different. So we will open a script tag, be sure to close the script tag, and in the opening tag, we will include an attribute named type. We will provide it a value of text/JavaScript. Let's include a second attribute named source, and this is our chance to point the web browser to the new Cycle2 file. So it lives within the JS folder, and its name is cycle2.js. So this line of code is complete. We've successfully added the file to our page. However, the Cycle2 JavaScript file has a dependency of jQuery. Now those are 2 terms that might not make sense right now, dependency and jQuery. A dependency simply means that a file relies on a different file in order to run correctly. And jQuery is the world's most popular JavaScript library. So in other words, we need to include a second JavaScript file in our page named jQuery. So behind the scenes, I've already downloaded jQuery to my desktop. Again, you can perform a web search for jQuery, or you can find this file in the downloadable zip for this lecture. So again, we need to move this file to live with our other website files. And in our head section, we can simply duplicate this script line that we just wrote. And in the first line, we'll simply change the name of the file. So instead of cycle2, look for jQuery.js. Now that we've added these files to our page, Cycle 2 can begin to work its magic. By default, Cycle 2 will actively search our page. It'll search through our HTML code, looking for an element that has a class of Cycle Slideshow. If and when it finds an element with that class, it will then cycle through the content of that element. So for example, if we want to create a slideshow out of our 3 images, the bee, the duck, and the squirrel, all we need to do is wrap these images in a div. Here's the closing tag. Let's indent our content to stay organized and give this new div a class of Cycle Slideshow. So if I save and refresh in the web browser, we can see that there is now only one image location. We can see that Cycle 2 is doing its job. So every 5 seconds or so, it cycles between the different contents of the div that we created. So you can see how it earns its name of cycle. Now for some of you, this is your first time consciously observing JavaScript. Now JavaScript is used for many things in the modern era, but perhaps most famously, it's used to manipulate web pages on the fly without a page refresh. So in order to create this slideshow effect, Cycle 2 is manipulating our images on the fly every 5 seconds or so. So for example, if I right-click on an image and click Inspect Element, here's the image for the squirrel. You can see that its opacity is currently set to 0, so it's invisible. But now in the background, you see the squirrel is displaying, and its opacity is set to 1, so fully visible. And again, obviously it's hidden in the background again, so now its opacity is 0. In a few seconds here, you'll see that now its opacity is set to 1. Now we didn't add any of these additional properties that we see here. So for example, here is the image for the duck. You can see that it's receiving position absolute, top left, z-index, visibility, opacity, display. We didn't add any of that. The Cycle 2 script is adding those properties on the fly, and then every 5 seconds it's manipulating those properties to create the illusion of a slideshow. Now we don't need to worry about any of this manipulation for the time being. We're going to let Cycle work its magic in the background. I'm going to close the inspector. I just wanted to give you a quick idea of what JavaScript is doing behind the scenes. And now let's spend the rest of this lesson manipulating the slideshow to look more like the original example we saw, with the previous and next buttons, and the pagination dots, and the text overlays for each slide. So let's hop back over to the slideshow that we were creating together. Here it is. And let's adjust what we consider a slide. So currently, Cycle 2 is cycling between image elements. But we don't want a slide to simply be an image. We want a slide to be a combination of an image and a bit of text. So let's create a div with a class of slide for each slide. So this div will contain an image and descriptive text. So there's the image. Let's create an additional div with a class of slide text. And this is where we can include, if we jump back to the finished product, this text. So a title, maybe a paragraph or one sentence, and then some sort of button. So back to the example that we're working on. In this slide text div, let's include a heading, B title here, and then a bit of descriptive text. This is the caption or descriptive text for the B slide. So now this slide is a combo of image and text. So now we just need to create one of these slide divs for the duck and squirrel slides. Now I won't waste your time by having you watch me do that, so I'm going to pause the video and then come back. Welcome back. So here is the bee slide, here is the duck slide, and here is the squirrel slide. So now if we save and refresh, we can see that our slideshow is completely broken. So Cycle 2 no longer knows how to cycle through our content, because by default, Cycle 2 wants to search for images, not for divs. However, it is incredibly easy to customize Cycle 2 to fit our needs. So if we scroll up and find the overall parent div that has a class of Cycle Slideshow, we can add an additional attribute to this div, Data Cycle Slides. Now this is your first time seeing a data attribute. Now in and of itself, this attribute doesn't mean anything to the web browser. However, JavaScript can access this attribute very easily. So Cycle 2 has an option named Cycle Slides, and we can provide a value which Cycle 2 can use. So this attribute is essentially asking, what would you like to cycle through? Now by default, Cycle 2 wants to search for any immediate image elements, but we can pass it any CSS style selector we want. So period means class, and then slide. So this will tell Cycle 2 to look for any elements that have a class of slide and use them as the slides. So for example, if instead of slide we named each one of these divs item, then we could change this to be .item. But obviously we will leave it as slide. Now if we save and refresh, the first thing I see is that we need a bit of CSS to come to the rescue very quickly. So I'm going to hop over to our style sheet, create a new comment to stay organized, slideshow styles. So I want to target the slide divs and just make sure that they have a width of 100%. Much better. So now we can see that cycle is cycling between the slide divs. So here is the image and the duck text. Here is the squirrel image and the squirrel text. So from here, we can just apply a bit of custom CSS to recreate this overlay effect that we see. So let's hop back over to the slideshow that we are working on together, and let's write a bit of custom CSS. So I want the slides to use position relative because I want to be able to position the slide text div using position absolute. Position absolute, and I want it to sit at the bottom. So if I save and refresh, you can see that the text is now overlaying the image just like we want. Let's also give the text area a background color of semi-transparent black. So we'll use RGBA instead of hexadecimal. So this is black, and we'll give it transparency of about 70%. Let's make the text white. Let's make sure that this text area uses the full available width, and let's also give it a bit of padding, so 20 pixels. Now because the element is using 100% width and we're also giving it padding, I'm going to use box sizing border box so that the element isn't larger than 100%. If I save and refresh, you can see we're almost there. The first thing that I notice is that the black box is not perfectly aligned with the bottom of the image or the slide area. So we can fix that by making sure that any image elements inside a slide are set to display block. Much better. Now very quickly, let's work on the spacing between this title and paragraph text. Create a new rule, slide text. Let's target the H3 element, set its margin to 0. Much better. Now let's give the slideshow itself a bit of bottom margin. So in our style sheet, create a new rule, select the overall cycle slideshow element, margin bottom, 30 pixels. So that looks better. Now there's a bit of space here. Moving on, let's add the previous and next buttons so that users can rapidly click to advance through the slides. So in our HTML, within the cycle slideshow parent div, Cycle 2 by default will search for an element that has a class of cycle-prev, and also it will search for an element that has a class of cycle-next. So let's include a bit of text in these that makes sense. So within the cycle-previous element, we'll include text that says previous. Within this one, we'll include text that says next. So if I refresh and click on next, you can see I can very rapidly advance through the slides. So now let's just add a bit of custom CSS to style these so that they actually look like user interface buttons. So let's hop over to our CSS file. Let's create a comment to stay organized. Prev and next buttons. So let's begin with the previous button. It had a class of cycle-prev. So let's position it so that it sits right about here in the slideshow. So we use position absolute because the overall slideshow element has a value of position relative. So we'll say position yourself from the top about 30%. Let's again use a background color of transparent black, so RGBA. 35%. Make the color of the text white. Let's give it a bit of padding so that it's easier to click the button. If we're giving the element padding, let's be sure to make the element block level. Let's also make the cursor set to pointer so that it looks like a link when we hover over it. And let's increase the font size a bit. Finally, we will set a z-index to a fairly high value so that this UI button is layered on top of the slides themselves. So if we refresh, here's the button. We can click it and it works just like we would expect. Now let's add styles to the next button. So it is almost identical to the previous button. So we actually want to reuse all of these styles for the next button. So I'll simply tack on a new selector for this rule, cycle next. Now the only thing that we want to be unique about the next button is that we want it to be positioned to the right. So let's create a new rule for cycle next. The only unique property it needs is right 0. So if we refresh, now the next button is in place. Now let's adjust things so that these previous and next buttons only display while we're hovering over the slideshow. So we can set their default opacity to 0, and then if someone hovers over the overall slideshow, so cycle slideshow hover, then go within and grab the cycle previous button, set its opacity to 1. We'll also want to adjust the selector to include cycle next. So if we refresh, we can see they're not visible. If we hover over the slideshow, now the buttons are visible. And we can get a bit fancy if we want. We can make it so that instead of just appearing, the buttons fade into view. So we can say transition, opacity, half of a second. And now, over the course of a second, they fade in and out of view. Next, what if instead of the words previous and next, we can include just arrows that point in the left and right directions? So in our HTML, I will remove previous and use a symbol that points to the left, and I will remove next and use a symbol that points to the right. So this takes up less space and is a bit more intuitive.